take a seat so we can get started. We have more than enough material to last the whole rest of the day, so settle in. Obviously, Tuesday's election has changed things, and there's a slew of policy issues that need to be addressed. And I really can't think of a better panel to address this. Just quickly, down at the end is Ariel KATZ, CEO of and co-founder of H1. Then there's John O'Brien, who's president and CEO of the National Pharmaceutical Council. Dan Mendelsohn, who has had many, many careers already at OMB, running a consulting group, and now at Morgan Health trying to fix the whole healthcare system. We wish him good luck. And of course, Janet Woodcock, who's been a senior leader at the FDA since I was in diapers and is still younger than I am. So I think it's in our interest just to dive in. We're going to reserve, the original plan was 10 minutes to talk about the election. It'll probably be more like 20, but as you'll see, we're going to end up discussing what's going to happen in the future throughout, and that obviously is shaped heavily by the election. So the first thing I want to talk about is we've had round one of the drug price negotiations, and I think the question is, how did they turn out, and what does that turnout portend for the future in terms of innovation and costs to the American public and the world? So the question is, were they a win-win-win? Did someone lose? And what do we anticipate for the future? So with that, I'm going to start with Dan Mendelsohn, who maybe has the broadest perspective on this, having been both in government and the private sector here.
It's a non-trivial question, Zeke. Thank you very much for starting with me. I want to say a little bit about kind of the seat that I'm sitting in right now. So Morgan Health, we're equity investors. It's a subsidiary of JPMorganChase. We're investing off of the balance sheet. We take minority positions in companies that we believe can accelerate innovation in employer-sponsored healthcare. So that's kind of the setup that I'm living in right now. Look, I'll say a couple of things about the price negotiation. It's been interesting to see how it has evolved. Last year's Galien forum, Dave Ricks made some comments about how the Inflation Reduction Act changed the incentives for drug development. And I think that is really fundamental and very important to start with because, the drug price negotiation, look, it was a group of drugs, high expense for Medicare. It does look like it will bring the prices down substantially when it's implemented, if it is allowed to progress. And I think that is an if at this point, not an absolute, because the new administration coming in is going to look really carefully at every regulation and plan, and they will have the right and ability to pull things back. And so, when I was running OMB Health and came in, kind of in the end of the Clinton administration, we did the first draft of the HIPAA regs. When the Bush administration came in, they pulled back the regulation that we had been working on for a year and completely rewrote it. And that is the way that things work. And I would expect the new administration to come in and dig into it. I do think that in the context of next year, that it is legitimate to be talking about the basic construct because, the question I think that we should really be thinking about is, have we set the right incentives for drug development? And if we haven't, it's probably an opportunity to rethink it.
John.
Well, thanks, Zeke. I agree with Dan on that. It's an important question. Look, I'm a pharmacist who leads a 70-year-old research organization, and before taking that job, I worked in government as well and worked really closely with Secretary Azar on the last administration's drug pricing blueprint. And I think in all of those roles, I learned that good policy begins with good evidence. And what the evidence says about the IRA thus far is that it's a poorly designed policy that has a lot of unintended consequences on drug development. It has uncertain impact on patients, and it's likely going to have higher costs than the Congressional Budget Office ever projected. I think it's first really important to understand the clock that we've referred to within the drug price negotiation program, which selects drugs for setting a maximum fair price after they've been on the market for 7 or 11 years. And what our peer-reviewed research says is that that approach has a real potential to delay launches until there are more indications to start that clock, or reduce the amount of research that's done to develop subsequent indications after a drug is approved. And that also has a real chilling effect on the kind of evidence that we use to understand outcomes and inform clinical guidelines. So I'm really concerned about all of those things. I'm more concerned that it's going to have a potentially even more profound effect in oncology and orphan oncology and other rare diseases. The second concern is that it also changes the economic incentives for Part D plans. It asks plans to take on 3-4 times the risk than they did before, while also taking away the rebates that they relied on, which means either they're going to increase premiums, which we're already seeing the impact of, and I think CMS is pumping $7 to $10 billion into the Part D plans to support premiums. But it also means that there's a potential that the plans may make it harder for patients to get access to these medicines and prefer other drugs.
So can I put you on the spot?
Yeah.
If you had 2 or 3 suggestions for how to fix or reform the IRA on this, what would they be?
You know, I don't know that I would start with this law and try to...
But it is the law.
And try to fix it. You know, I think it's really important to look at the way that products are selected for this program and look at fixing the clock. The clock today seems to say that small molecules don't add value, and that's not true. In fact, oftentimes they have a lot more value than we give them credit for. The second thing, I think this one orphan designation excludes you from negotiation, but another orphan designation doesn't, really penalizes companies that want to invest in rare disease. So that's something else that I'd look at. But I think the biggest thing, Zeke, is that this policy is one more approach that tries to take money out of the pharmaceutical industry to pay for other priorities. And when you add the IRA with the Medicaid drug rebate program and 340B and 50% gross to net, you're taking money out of an industry that uses that revenue for R&D. And I think if we keep cutting this industry, we're going to hit an artery.
You know, Zeke, I would add one thing maybe, then
Okay.
And it probably takes you over into Janet's world a little bit, but you know, one of the things, and I agree with John about evidence and that you want value-based work and you want to make sure that the products that are coming in are adding value, and you want to be thinking about the pricing relative to the value that they bring to the healthcare system. And if we agree with that as a basic proposition, you know, CMS doesn't really have information nearly to the extent that FDA does. And one thing that I think is important that we should really be thinking about is raising the evidentiary requirements around the health system. You know, in other words, the pharma companies are producing a huge amount of evidence that is going into FDA, understandably. In most countries, there is also an economic dossier that is prepared. We don't have that here, and it would be incredibly useful as a payer. And from the employer perspective, I'll say that we don't have the evidence that we need to really judge the value of the products in a way that is disciplined, and that would be something that we might want to think about.
Can I just raise the small issue that the idea of having cost-effectiveness analysis and using cost-effectiveness analysis for any governmental decision, highly resisted by industry. Let's just be blunt about it.
Sure, but put the information out. Let's have the information. And you know, again, how are payers?
I was for it, but
it's not just about the quality. Okay. Absent a predictable and transparent process that manufacturers can participate in and anticipate, there's no value in me building a robust HEOR, real-world evidence enterprise if CMS is just going to say, well, we're going to look at the lowest net price we can find, we're going to look at cost of goods, we're going to look at ex-US prices. There's no certainty that the process that Dan described is going to be based on value at all.
Okay, Ariel, you look like you're chomping at the bit.
I was listening at the bit as well. There's a great conversation there. So the perspective I have is help run this company, H1. We work with patients, payers, providers, pharma companies. And the thing, if we take a step back, IRA was passed in 2022. The year before, our industry saved a pandemic. And yet everyone's saying we defeated the pharma industry with pricing the year later. Like, something's not adding up. The other thing that's not adding up to me is policymakers are saying they made, for example, insulin $35 capped at $35. Go and talk to Lilly. They tried to make it $35 too, and they weren't able to. And so I think it's more than just the math equation and why they pick 13 years and why they pick 7 years and what's it going to be in the Trump administration. I think people are just upset, and I think the public's upset, and they think that our pharma industry is making more of their share. And until that changes, I think IRA was obviously not great for all the things that John said, but it's not going to get any better until we change public perception. And that's my take on it. Because the best thing we could have done is save a pandemic. Got everyone out of their homes, kids back in school, and the year later they were celebrating that they beat pharma, which isn't adding up. And so I think it's just going to get worse unless we start to change public perception around it. And when we talk to our stakeholders that we engage with every day, people are still upset with pharma after all the things that we continue to do for them and all the innovation we're bringing. So even if it's true that we add all this value and the cost to the healthcare systems, nobody thinks that Ozempic is not making it cheaper for the health system. Yet, a few weeks ago, the CEO of Novo Nordisk was grilled by the U.S. Senate about pricing.
Let's be clear. It's not clear it's saving money, okay? It might be cost effective, but that's different than saving the health system money. And I would agree with you. When you have 90% of the public who wants drug price regulation, unless you change that number, it's hard to get reform. I would. They're all employed in the health system. We have 17 million employees. The other point I would make, that's a necessary component, but it's not sufficient. And in this crowd, I'll go out on a limb, but I always go out on a limb, as Ken well knows. Unless you come with a positive proposal that the public can understand, that the public can see is in their interest in terms of innovation and in terms of pricing, it's going to be very hard. Things are going to be done to you rather than with you. And this idea of transparency, predictability, et cetera, won't happen without you're coming with a very understandable positive proposal. I've been saying this for, 10 years, but I think it's not come through. So that's the way.
Zeke, how could we do it with PBMs holding us?
Oh, that's the next
that's
question.
The next topic. Thank you very much for Ariel. I paid him $20 to do that. Okay. PBMs, we all know, are, after pharma, maybe the most hated group in American medicine. And the reason is, I think, pretty clear and frankly, has been laid out over the last couple of years very substantially. Highly concentrated industry with three of the big ones controlling, 80+%, 85%, six of them, basically having over 90% of the market. And as I was preparing for this, I plugged into AI about PBMs, and I came back with this quote from my assistant. In 2023, rebates and fees accounted for 42% of all drug spend, leading to the pharmaceutical benefit management market in the United States being valued over $500 billion. Consequently, I think, this is me now, PBMs are clearly going to be in the crosshairs of any administration, since they're going to have to raise money and want a lower cost for people. What is the future, looking at your tea leaves, and more importantly, in my view, what's the responsible PBM policy for us to adopt?
Zeke, you need to update your AI software because about 53% of what we call drug spending in the United States is actually going to someone other than the company that took the risk.
Yeah, but this just said PBMs. I don't have to update it. I just asked them about PBMs.
So these vertically integrated companies who are near the top of the Fortune 500, right, are the reason that when patients go to the pharmacy counter, despite 7 years of declining net prices, they're not getting relief. And the reason that 90 whatever percent of the country says they want government regulation of prices is because of the price that they're asked to pay at the pharmacy counter, which is a function of the benefit design that they have. 7 years ago, when I was writing a regulation that would have done away with rebates in Medicare Part D, very few people knew what rebates actually were. And today you've got the FTC, Republicans and Democrats in Congress, presidential campaigns, all focused on this topic. But the most important thing is that employers are starting to become more aware of this. That's why I'm really glad that Diane's on this panel. You know, we did some research that looked at the role of rebate guarantees in choosing a formulary. And we were really surprised to find out that 60% of employers surveyed found that the benefits consultant that they hired was the most influential in helping to set up their benefit design. And if you're basing a benefit design based on rebate guarantees, you're not choosing a high-value formulary. So that's why Mark Cuban tweeted our AJMC research out. But the other day, the National Alliance of Healthcare Purchasers came out with new research that said employers who chose a value-based formulary as opposed to a rebate-driven formulary saved 3 times as much or had 3 times less spending. And the reason that this is all important, the reason that we need rebate reform, is I've heard 2 stories when I was in government. The first was a nearly retired pharmaceutical executive telling me about the number of times they've tried to launch the best drug in the class at the lowest price and nobody wanted it. They wanted margin and rebate. They didn't want efficacy and savings. And the second thing is...
So John, I'm going to ask you again. What are the 2 or 3 reforms you would suggest? Look, you know, you can suggest to Bernie Sanders. He's got 10 weeks to go, right? You know, the question is, what are we going to recommend as a reasonable policy for, they are going to be regulated. I have no doubt about it, because both the Dems and the Republicans are going to want to do it. What's the policy we ought to recommend so we don't end up with an IRA where everyone's pissed off?
I'd focus on them not being paid for the list.
Eliminating rebates?
For the amount of the price of the drug, but instead getting them to something that's more based on a fee for the service that they're actually providing. But again, I think it's really important to create a system where these discounts are reaching the patients and employers are choosing formularies based on the value the drug brings and not the size of the check they get at the end of the year.
Yes, Dan?
Okay. I'm going to bring a slightly different perspective to this, as John probably knows that I'm going to. And I'm probably the only one up here who has ever operated in a PBM, owned a PBM, and now I'm purchasing from a PBM, so right. I've seen it. I think it's important to start with the fact that PBMs provide some very important services for employers and Medicare beneficiaries. They include creating a competitive market for drugs, because if you have similar drugs, you want to play them off against one another to create a competitive market. That's in the interest of the buyer, and it's also ultimately in the interest of the pharmaceutical industry. And that's kind of thing one. And then, you know, there's a kind of a range of conveniences, if you will. Someone has to set up a competitive market for pharmacy services. Why should one pharmacy be able to charge more than another? Like, you have to be able to create a competitive market. And drug markets are complex. I mean, there is a level of knowledge that employers will not have and needs to be brought to the market by an intermediary. So, you know, much as the PBM industry has been vilified with advertising, and, you know, you got that like white guy who looks like a used car salesman pop up on your screen all the time. I don't know if you do, but I do. It's a very important function, all right? Now, in the context of running, you know, kind of a major benefit for a U.S. corporation, our team has looked carefully at all of these alternatives. And look, the PBMs are going to get paid one way or the other. And you think about what incentives you want to give to the PBM. Do you want to do an incentive based on drug price, which incents them to use a less expensive drug? Do you want to pay them on a fee basis, which incents them perhaps more neutrally with respect to value? And I think that you know, transparency is good. Like, we demand a level of transparency from our, but it's and what Mark Cuban is doing is primarily focused on generics. It's not focused on the branded side.
company.
Right. And so that's what is available in the market to a buyer, right? And so rhetoric aside, that's kind of where he's focused. And so if you want to create a competitive benefit, most US corporations will still go through a PBM. So in answer to the question of the things that we should ask about,
Yes.
and like what I would want, transparency I think is very important. I think value-based design is important. I think that there should be more of a requirement around value-based design. And then I think it is, and I'm going to go back to the point that I was making before, if the pharmaceutical companies do not give information about cost effectiveness that is accurate, predictable, and transparent, then that information will never be used for drug pricing. And that kind of brings us back to the point of maybe we need a disciplined process in this country to bring cost effectiveness information to the fore.
And where would you house that, out of curiosity?
Not in the government.
Yeah,
Not in the government. Well, we do have, we have
let's
ICER.
let John run it.
We have ICER. What's wrong with ICER?
So look, ICER and others who are doing this today have a process that's driven by both science and assumptions. And the assumptions that ICER chooses today ignore a lot of the benefits that employers and society would find value: productivity, caregiver burden, cost offset, et cetera. So if I'm the one designing the amount of cost offset that I'm going to include in my model, I have the potential for that to show more or less cost offset. But the thing that Dan didn't talk about is the fact that if I'm a vertically integrated company, and I own a health plan and a pharmacy and a PBM, then I can pay, as a health plan, my pharmacies more than the pharmacies that aren't in my network, and then use that to generate savings with my PBM, and I'm taking money from my right pocket to my left pocket and putting it in my back pocket, and the independent pharmacist in me, right, wants to say that that's not good for patient access.
But here's the question, though. As a purchaser, I don't want to create all sorts of silos, like the drug silo and the medical silo. I actually want those two things to be together, because if spending more on drugs will reduce my medical spend, I want to do that all day. And so, one of the questions, and I think this underlied the fact that, you have all the major PBMs now owned by insurance companies, and I think it's fair to say that, even though you have some upstarts that, by the way, we've looked at and evaluated for investments, so kind of have looked into the guts of them. But all of the major ones being owned by insurance companies, I think, is reflective of the fact that the functions should be together, should be linked.
None of the big three, I agree with you, none of the big three are looking at Melinda's research that says if we spend a little more on drugs, we can save a lot more on total cost of care. Mm-hmm. They're just continuing to fragment it and now trying to do for medical benefits what they're doing for pharmacy benefits. Okay,
you guys have introduced the last two topics I want to get to before we shift to the election result. The next topic, which Dan introduced, and Janet, you are really have been thinking deep about, is generics. The United States is, I think, unique in the world in that we have the absolute highest brand name prices in general and the absolute lowest generic prices. And what we've been experiencing over the last number of years is a lot of generic shortages. That's a market which does not seem to be working. We seem to be winnowing out competition. The margins seem to be too low to make people invest in the supply chain. How do you think about this, and what are the reforms we need for the generic industry to make it more vibrant, to ensure the supply is kept up, and to make sure that the American public can get the drugs when they want it?
Well, I'm not a finance person like these guys, or, I can't say what how that part should change, but I can explain the problem. I mean, we issued a report, I think, a number of years ago, meaning when I was at the FDA, that was pretty definitive. I mean, the problem is the purchasing organizations have asked for a basket of drugs, okay, and they're just going to go for the lowest bidder, and they're very large. Okay, so pretty soon we have 5 generic manufacturers, 3 of them are out of the game. And so they stop production. Okay, why would they keep making it? They could make it for their other parts of the world maybe, but they're not making money on that. So pretty soon we have, and of course there's this cost minimization by the purchasers, okay, which is highly rational economically, okay, they don't see the consequences or bear the costs of the shortages where people are running around, the drugs are scalped, you know, and they're paying thousands of dollars for a vial of cancer. But we shouldn't be paying, and I've testified before Congress, you know, the cup of Starbucks, we pay more for that than we do for a vial of cisplatin or carboplatin. How can we justify that, okay? Well, because the people are buying, they're just buying a basket, okay? And they're just getting the lowest price. And so that's how the system is working. And what's happening, the generic industry is in crisis, all right? Because, okay, this one guy who's still in the market, so they're not making very much because they had to put in a very low bid to get into this. Is this right, finance guys? Okay, to get into the basket, you know, and then they're not upgrading their facility. Okay, and every year we see it go down. And the FDA goes in and they inspect and they say you have all these problems. They give them a 483. But what are they going to do? Shut them down? They're the only supplier. Okay, so what are they going to do? Like they're going to beat up on them and try to get them, maybe shut down some of their other parts or whatever. And it's this vicious cycle. You cannot make, especially sterile injectables, like, you know, like less for Starbucks. It's just not going to work. So that's the problem. I don't know what the solution is. What I've been trying to do is several things, because we don't just, you know, I think the idea that, okay, we'll have one plant in the U.S. and that'll be good, that really works like North Carolina, right? We need redundancy. And for those who don't know, the saline shortage, okay, we had one plant in the U.S. in North Carolina, Western North Carolina, making all 60% of the saline bags, okay? Well, and when you have a natural disaster, what do you need? You need more IV fluids, among other things, okay? What do we had? We had a lot less IV fluids, okay? So we need redundancy, we need resilience, we need surge capacity. That's how we should be thinking. These generic drugs are this mainstay of medicines for most of our population. That's where you go to Walmart and you get your basket of drugs every month for $10 or whatever they charge, right? And those are all generics.
Well,
okay?
do you think we need price supports for generics? I mean, that's a big headline. We need to raise the price on drugs.
Like I said, I don't know anything about money, so don't ask me. I can just tell you what the problems are. I can't tell you can't tell you what the solutions are. I've been working on it. Several things. Advanced manufacturing, okay? What is that? That's continuous manufacturing, much more efficient. We could bring that back to the United States and make more drugs here, even generics, if you used because the environmental footprint is much smaller, the actual facility footprint is smaller, you're using much smaller labor force. Because right now, most of these generic drugs, it's like cooking or like pharmacy long ago, okay? They have the mixers, but they're just really big, and they have the funnels, but they're 2 stories high. I mean, it is not high technology. So the government could support, and they were doing a tiny bit, which, you know, I got them to do when I was at the agency, investment in advanced manufacturing, okay? Because that is potentially, we could bring some of that back to the United States. But as far as, and then some of these nonprofits that are starting up where the hospitals are getting together, okay, and they're buying generic license, you know, approvals, and they're doing a nonprofit for these, especially the sterile injectables, which are like orphans. Everything on your crash cart, okay, is something you paid 50 cents for, okay? And if it goes into shortage, like, you're going to go berserk, but nobody else will care, okay? You know, it's just a 50-cent item, right? But it was epinephrine or something, right? So, or it's an antibiotic. So I think that's a good mechanism. So there are workarounds to this whole problem. And I've concluded, because this financial arrangement seems so intractable, even the one you were talking about before, I've concluded workarounds are probably the best way to deal with this.
John, do you think we need government regulation and what type, or government intervention?
I think we need to fix the perverse incentives in the system that create the problems that Janet just described. I took my mom to get her flu shot, and she filled a prescription. She walks to the counter, the pharmacist hands her a bag. My mom says, "This is the brand, I wanted the generic." And the pharmacist says, your plan wants you to have the brand. And my mom says,
That's the
it's
basket.
probably the rebates. And the pharmacist looks at me and I said, I don't know where she gets this stuff. But in the last 2 years,
That's good.
we've seen the biggest selling drug in the United States launch with 5, 6, 7 biosimilar competitors, and very few of them have had sales, right? They offered a low list price version. Nobody wanted it, right? So these incentives are really driving behavior, and the buying groups that Janet's talking about are really important as long as we look at taking money out of the price of a drug as opposed to preferring a low-cost, high-value product. We're never going to fix this system.
Ariel, you were...
Yeah, it goes back to the two discussions we've been having. PBMs used to be price capped, like profit capped, 70s or 60s. I don't know why we don't, I don't know who changed that, I don't know which administration, but I don't understand why we got rid of capping PBM's profits. What regulation should we add? Go back to what worked back then. They offer value in the system. But in the 70s, there wasn't OpenAI or AI or software that could say, here's all the data on the drugs, here's the efficacy data, here's the safety data, here's the HEOR data, and here's what the formulary should be based off all that data. You needed human beings doing that. I'm sure engineers in the world can do that for you and pretty easily these days. And as the data gets better, it will just get cheaper. And it should be one integrated system. Why are all these payers buying them? It's one offering. No one in the street thinks it's a separate company in the middleman. It seems like it should be part of the payer. They're paying for it. They should write the formulary, and they should cap profits on that.
As the representative of the payer, Diane,
Okay, I want to say first before I get there, I'm not a big fan of price caps, and I don't think that people in this
Profit
room are
caps.
going to be particularly enthusiastic about saying like all healthcare, organizations have to have a profit cap. And so, look, I think that from having kind of engaged with members of Congress, there are some members of Congress who are very comfortable with caps on profits. It's not something that, frankly, from a policy perspective, I think is very productive. Look, employers is pretty basic. I mean, employers use generics to drive prices down for consumers, which I think, Ariel does address the core issue of trust that you addressed before, to the extent that those prices are actually passed on to the consumer. There are certainly cases, this great anecdote, where those prices are not passed on. There are many other cases, my generic atorvastatin is free under the plan. Like most generics are free under our plan, and that's a good design. Like you want to make generics free to consumers so that they see that and they have an incentive to actually use the product. I do think that there is a strategic national interest in bringing manufacturing back to the United States, and that the supply chain interruptions that we had during the pandemic would recur again today if we don't do something about it.
Worse.
It would be worse. And so, and I think this is largely getting ignored, along with a lot of the other stuff that we're ignoring that happened during the pandemic that, again, will happen again if we don't get our arms around some of the supply chain issues. So whether it's a subsidy or whether it's a change in the tax code, you could do it different ways, but I think that we should be incenting domestic production and then also making sure that the savings associated with generics are passed on to consumers.
and the incenting domestic production through Medicare, mandating for Medicare and Medicaid programs, exchange.
It could be done in a lot of different ways. It could be done through tax. It could be done through mandates. I think then it becomes your taste for what do you want to do. But look, I think from my perspective, like what's going to happen over the next year with respect to a new Trump administration is that there's going to be a lot of discussion about tax. And there's going to be, extensions of the tax cuts, and there's going to be, so tax is going to be
Along
a
with
place
tariffs.
where
Let's not forget tariffs on imports.
tax is going to be a place where a lot of things can get done, and I think it is more likely that this could happen in the context of tax than in a change to Medicare.
Okay, Janet?
So I don't think we should forget the technical part, though. We need to we need to train a workforce. We need to advance the science. People aren't going to come and build plants that cost $1 zillion to do that unless the tools are available, unless the new kinds of equipments are generally used, unless people are confident this is going to work, right? Which it will, I can tell you, but it's the future, can come soon or later depending on. So I think the US, even if they're screwing around with all these arguments and everything, they could invest in the technology development now, okay, because everybody likes that, right? And, we have some centers that are, universities that are doing advanced manufacturing, training people on this, but it's like 2. Okay, so I think investment in the technology by the government is rational at this moment.
All right, well, we have a new election, and the question is, what do we think we can anticipate from this new administration in the realm of drug pricing, incentivizing purchasers in other ways? Anyone want to take it on? Besides getting rid of fluoride in your water, okay? That's a given. That's going to happen, whether you like it or not.
So there's a part of this conversation that for me begins with the fact that for the first time in my career, public policy, drug pricing policy, is creating as much risk for innovation as clinical or regulatory risk. And my team works really hard to do the research, to understand the business risk of public policy. And that good policy begins with good evidence. So look, I've worked with people in this administration. I've worked with people in the last administration. We're going to continue to do the research to explain how this industry works and how these incentives affect innovation. And I hope they continue to find it valuable.
The tax law, what do you think is going to happen? Dan mentioned the 2017 tax cuts are going to expire, and we're going to have a decision about extending them, revising them. What shape would you like it to look like?
Maybe taking a little bit of a step back in terms of like what to expect over the next couple of years. I think, with alignment between the White House, the House, and the Senate, things will move faster. Mm-hmm. There will be more action, if you will. And I think that there are a couple of immediate forcing events that will cause policy change. The first is the expiration of the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. They need to be extended. I think that everybody has an interest in this. Otherwise, there will probably be between 20 and 50 million people who are going to lose insurance. So that's something that definitely requires attention and is important. Then,
Dan, can you explain the 20 to 50 million? That's a very high number.
Well, you have about 50 million people who have insurance under the ACA, about 30 million in Medicaid, and 20 million in the exchanges.
And the subsidies are only exchange issues.
And the subsidies go to about 80% of the people in the exchanges.
Yes.
And so, it's sensitive and it's important, and screwing it up would result in a lot of people losing their insurance. And then, with respect to the Medicaid changes, those could also potentially be reversed, and that's something that has been discussed by some folks in kind of the orbit. If you look at the much ballyhooed Project 2025, there's all sorts of Medicaid policy in there. So I'm just saying, these are very sensitive. Now, there are two other issues that I think are perhaps even more important for the people in this room. The first is vaccination and the basic mistrust of vaccination that I think could really upend the current paradigm. And that is, I don't know who can talk to these people, but this is really important. And that's a place that I think, is, it worries me. I think it worries all of us. And it's vaccination as an aspect of medical science, so it's pretty basic. And then the second piece is I'll say, kind of for the lack of a better term, oversight of public health and the FDA, in the sense that if you go in and believe that CDC and FDA are irreparably screwed up and that you just need to fire half the people, we're going to have really big problems in this country. And so it's like, do you come in and thoughtfully address issues, or are you like kind of coming in with an axe? And that worries me, and I think should worry everybody here. And it's something that I think will require engagement of the industry on these issues. The pricing stuff. Look, there's opportunity there, as we talked about before, to address some of the issues that have come up in the past, and I think that those could be productive conversations. But the other two are more fundamental.
Well, I have to say that I have an op-ed at the Times coming out, I hope, on the vaccine issue. And one of the things I'm really worried about is even if they do nothing and just talk about it, right, it's going to put a huge chill in anybody's interest in researching it, right? There's not going to be a new vaccine, and who's going to rush in if we have some outbreak of H5N1 to produce a vaccine? So I do think the industry needs to educate them a little bit about incentives.
And see, this is just where I think if I've learned anything in 2 tours of duty is that personnel is policy. Yeah. And there's a real difference between what you hear on the campaign trail and what you actually start to see in a policy agenda. So I'm going to wait and see who gets into some of these roles before starting to think about what the actual policy agenda is.
Oh my God, you're an optimist. I love that.
Well, have you heard any names floated in this area that have warmed your heart?
Yeah, Bobby Jindal. I think he would be capable. Honestly.
Yeah, do you think he's going to be Secretary of HHS?
I hope so, honestly.
All right, well, there's one name.
Yeah, on the positive side, if you look at the PBM legislation, who started that lawsuit? The FTC. Who does J.D. Vance like? Lena Khan, who runs the FTC. And so it was a bipartisan measure about PBMs bringing that into the limelight. We had conversations with folks on the Hill 5 years ago, 3 years ago. They didn't even know what a PBM was. Right. Now it's actually in the conversation.
You're welcome.
I think that would have happened whoever won the election. It's coming from the FTC. It's coming from both sides of the aisle. So that I feel good about that happening. Some change happening there, which will help folks in this room and the industry. I'm curious what you guys think about Trump trying to push legislation for drug pricing for most favored nations. Instead of having be U.S. foots the bill, we just take the average of what Germany.
Well, he didn't do it at the end of his last administration, despite talking about it. And now, at least I'm hearing that his plan to change, right, is now about baskets of drugs that are similar and having similar prices. I don't know.
This is funny because there have been many generations of officials, and I had this responsibility under the Clinton administration, who have had the responsibility to go to other countries and say, you're paying too little, or we're paying too much, or how do we work this out? And it just hasn't.
Why would they? What incentive do they have?
Exactly. It's like the Canadian system.
Janet, you were as I mentioned, at the FDA forever. What reforms would you suggest would make the agency work better, not just for the people in this room, but for the whole American society?
Well, right as I left, I performed 8,000-person reorganization of the foods program and the ORA field organization, which really that's only, I think the foods program is going to be solid, okay, but it has limited, we're not going to be able to remove the cereal aisle in the supermarket. Despite the
rhetoric. Much as RFK would like to do that.
Exactly, or the chips and crackers and all that stuff, that aisle they're not going to be able to take away half the supermarket and all of the fast food joints. The field still has a very long way to go to get to a highly professional. They were still sticking with their old ways, which is hire a GS5 or 7 person, just graduated from college, and we're inspecting these very high-tech industries. As far as each of the programs otherwise, say the device program or the drugs program, biologics, I think they're each separate and they have different challenges. I'm afraid what we'll see is that sort of the axe we're going to see potentially is a big slash in the domestic discretionary budget, which will that's the ACTS approach, okay, which is just, okay, riff a lot of people and then figure it out, all right? And of course, that's not the way to have really good change. It's not really good change management because people are in crisis. For the drugs program, you know, I'm working right now, for example, on proposing legislative reform for rare diseases, that we have a different way to meet the substantial evidence standard. And I believe that as precision medicine advances, that the RCT is not the right tool to use to evaluate targeted therapies in general. So we'll see how that goes. For drugs and for the drug program, I think I was pulled away to warp speed. I was in the middle of a reorganization of the Office of New Drugs, which does all the innovator stuff you're talking about here. You know, they need to get away from their evil ways of writing all this documentation about everything. That made a whole lot of sense when tractor trailers came up and everything and was dumped in these jackets, and then somebody do an archaeological expedition for a couple years to try and rewrite the story, and then they'd write, right now they write thousands of pages of review, and I think it's a waste of time, all right? And I think, you know, with modern technology and databases, we should look at the data, the protocol, the amendments, the IRB, the results, the data tables, and maybe some case reports, and that's what you look at, right? You don't need to, and we have CROs who rewrite up things, and then people send it into the agency and they rewrite it, and the statisticians write it, and so.
And do you think that the review process could go much faster that way? Would it be a win-win and be just as safe? Would that be a win-win for everyone?
I don't think the industry needs faster. I think what the industry needs is more thoughtful and more engagement with the agency, okay? I think the agency is too busy to have a lot of the early meetings to help shape the drug development program. And with the pace of science, agency reviewers have to get their heads around the new science. And the earlier they do that, the better, because you don't want people going and doing early development programs that aren't fit for purpose, that aren't.
The way to think about it, Zeke, is like if you can reduce the bureaucracy and get them to waste less time on all of this paperwork, they'll have more time for meaningful engagement.
Correct.
And that's a really serious issue. And the other thing I might add to yours that I'm interested
Well, how much, Dan, I'm ignorant about this. How much of that is self-inflicted by the FDA itself on its own processes?
100%.
Or is that regulatory, or is that legislative?
100% self-inflicted.
Well, or inflicted by OMB, or inflicted by other government paperwork requirements. Okay, so I don't necessarily fault the FDA for everything.
But it's not legislative, so therefore it is something that, you know, if someone wanted to reform the system, they could actually make it more efficient without going to Congress for more.
Regulatory.
Yeah, well, what I was talking about, though, the evidentiary standard,
Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
what I said you probably won't like, okay, is the evidentiary standard is substantial evidence.
Yeah.
And, okay, it was 2 adequate and well-controlled trials, and then it was 1 adequate and well-controlled trials and confirmatory evidence. We need to move to a totality of evidence standard for very rare diseases and for certain targeted therapies. And to do that for precision medicine, you need to do a Bayesian adaptive trial, unless
Yep.
you know in advance everything, which how are you going to do that? It's a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah, but that's internal to the FDA, right?
No, that's legislative. But the paperwork issue and the bureaucracy, I think that's all FDA self-imposed.
Okay. So there's one other thing that I think is really important, which is civil service reform, which is these gradations, and you were talking GS5. So, you know, there are very, very deep and very difficult rules about you know, personnel that will, like anybody who has worked in government, it will drive you crazy.
Yeah, well, we were
It
able to.
limits your flexibility.
Oh, it's
You
terrible.
can't get the best people. You can't pay the best people enough. Like it's really problematic.
We were able to get a special pay scale for the FDA, very limited under cures. The cures then expanded, and I put a lot of effort into that. But the bureaucracy outside of the agency, okay, is questioning that and trying to undermine it and so forth because they like the GS6 and the 5. And, you know, I always said the head of Charles River could not meet the standards for toxicologists that were written in 1984. Right? And it even specifies.
This isn't the administration that's going to do thoughtful redesign of your civil servants
Well,
rather than just fire them.
frankly, that's the one place that I think kind of a well-placed bomb might actually benefit us. Yeah.
If you could persuade them, that would be good. John, any other final suggestions for incoming administration that you would like them to?
No, look, I just want to remember where we are. And tonight, we're going to celebrate the fact that we're living in a golden age of biomedical innovation. And in the back of my mind, I'm going to be asking myself 3 questions. A, what are health plans going to do to build barriers to access? 2, what policy may destroy this kind of innovation? And 3, how much of the price of these medicines contains the gross to net that you have to feed the troll under the bridge before the patient can see it. So I want to continue to make sure that policymakers understand the incentives in this industry and not keep cutting into it in a way that they think is going to benefit patients.
Okay. Ariel.
I think this administration is actually easier to predict than if it was a different administration. They react to simple things. What will, for better or for worse, what will the public think about them? And what will they say at the second half of saying their name? And unless we change public perception, it's not going to go in our direction. As simple as that over the next 4 years. We might see some reform around PBMs, which is good, but I think it's as basic as that. I don't think it becomes more complicated. If they think they will continue to stay in office and win more seats, if they continue to knock pharma, they will continue to do so. And until that changes, I don't see how the administration changes their behavior.
Well, I do think this administration is going to be more business friendly. And I think in that light, honing the message as to what needs to be done and making it clear and simple is probably really important for them. Having interacted with the incoming president in the previous administration, simple could not be more important. And I think you have to persuade him that it's in his interest. Right. And I think, and it has to be very focused. And honing that in, I do think he'll listen to industry. I don't know that he'll follow it, but I think working on the message is going to be vitally important if we're going to get positive reform, and it can't be everything in the kitchen sink. So with that, I want to thank the panelists and thank you.
Thank you, Zeke.
Thank you.